The price of hell. Psychological collapse on the battlefield. Will men be able to give up toying with the idea of another war? Carl Jung once asked. It has now become a question of existence or non-existence for all of us. The danger that threatens humanity today is of such a terrifying dimension as to make the last great catastrophe. World War II seemed like a mere This warning, from Jung's epilogue to Essays on Contemporary Events, sets the stage for a critical examination of our relationship with conflict. War is deeply ingrained in our culture, our society, and our various. The entertainment industry often glorifies the horrors of war through movies, television shows, and video games. Politicians and bureaucrats frequently gain immense power through the fighting of wars. Many powerful corporations are profoundly enriched through the production of the weapons of war. War is also deeply embedded in the fabric of our history. We have fought wars since our time as hunter-gatherers, a grim tradition spanning millennia. War remains one of the most influential and destructive forces shaping the course of civilization. However, we now face a terrifying dilemma. War may be entrenched in our society, but the technologies of war have become so absolutely destructive. If a war breaks out between two major global powers, it possesses the undeniable potential to end civilization as we know it. War has become an activity that has surpassed the ability of human beings to endure it, wrote Richard Gabriel in No More Heroes. Madness and Psychiatry in War. In this exploration, we will delve into the psychology of man as it relates to the act of war. We will examine whether we are psychologically built to withstand the crushing stress of modern combat. We will ask if we are, by our very nature, killers at heart. We will also investigate how militaries utilize sophisticated psychological conditioning techniques to transform young men from peace-loving beings into soldiers who kill on command. Given the chronic persistence of war throughout history, the Latin proverb homo homini lupus, or man as a wolf to man, seems to ring true. But apart from a very small fragment of the population who display psychopathic traits of excessive violence and aggression, human beings are fundamentally not psychologically fit to fight in modern wars. Almost every single soldier who spends time in active combat, especially on the front lines of a major war, is psychologically harmed by the experience. World War II veteran William Manchester went so far as to suggest that to endure the horrors of war, it is necessary to adopt a mindset that, in any situation other than war, would be characterized as clinically insane. As he wrote, "No man in battle is really sane. The mindset of the soldier on the battlefield is a highly disturbed mind. This is an epidemic of insanity which affects everybody there, and those not afflicted by it die very quickly. The stress of battle is truly immense and multifaceted. A soldier knows he could die at any given moment. His senses are completely overwhelmed with the sights, sounds, and smells of the dying, many of whom are his friends and comrades. War also makes life utterly unpredictable. A soldier in active battle loses all control of his own fate. He is burdened with the unremitting hostility of an enemy who desperately wants his blood. If the hail of bullets and the explosion of bombs do not destroy his body, the raw experience of war will inevitably work to destroy his mind. A World War II Army medical report explains this stark reality. The key to an understanding of the psychiatric problem of war is the simple fact that the danger of being killed or maimed imposes a strain so great that it causes men to break down. One look at the apathetic faces of psychiatric cases as they come stumbling into the medical station is enough to convince most observers of this fact. They are often sobbing, trembling, and referring shudderingly to them, shells and two buddies, mutilated or dead. There is simply no such thing as getting used to combat. Each man up there knew that, at any moment, he might be killed. This fact was kept constantly before his mind by the sight of the dead and mutilated bodies all around him. A soldier's breakdown is never a result of cowardice. Courage is simply no antidote to the overwhelming stress of war. With enough time on the front lines, virtually every soldier is mentally harmed by his time in battle. The same World War II Army medical report explains further. Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their exposure. Thus, psychiatric casualties are as inevitable as gunshot and shrapnel wounds in warfare. Richard Gabriel echoes this powerful insight in his book. He states there is no evidence to support the commonly held view among the civilian populace, a view fostered by movies and television programs, that only the weak or the cowardly break down in battle. In reality, everyone is susceptible to psychiatric breakdown in war. The psychological toll is not just a possibility, it is a certainty. The human mind has its limits. Modern combat pushes individuals far beyond those limits daily. The constant state of hypervigilance depletes mental and emotional reserves. Sleep deprivation further exacerbates the psychological strain. The moral injury of participating in and witnessing horrific events creates deep, lasting. This is not a failure of character. It is a predictable outcome of an unbearable situation. The soldier's psyche is the first, and often the most permanent, casualty of war. Understanding this is the first step toward grasping the true cost of human conflict. The glorification of war ignores this fundamental truth. It presents a sanitized version of a deeply dehumanizing experience. This sanitized narrative is a dangerous fiction. It allows societies to continue sending their youth into situations that will irrevocably damage them. The reality is that the battlefield is a crucible that melts down the human spirit. The very act of survival often requires a temporary departure from sanity itself. This is the price of hell on earth. Breaking the barrier. The Psychology of Turning Civilians into Killers, Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, in his seminal work on killing, makes a provocative claim. He argues that despite an unbroken tradition of violence and war, man is not by nature a killer. This assertion challenges the common perception of humans as inherently aggressive beings. Grossman suggests that not only do we naturally abhor the act of killing another human, but most of us even loathe hostility or confrontation in our daily lives. As he writes, most avoid confrontations at all costs, to work ourselves up to an aggressive verbal action let alone. A physical confrontation is extremely difficult for the average person. Simply confronting the boss about a promotion or a raise is one of the most stressful and upsetting things most people can ever bring themselves to do. Many individuals never even get that far in their entire lives. Facing down the school bully or confronting a hostile acquaintance is something that most will avoid at all costs if possible. Some might think that this innate resistance to killing would simply disappear in the throes of battle. The assumption is that if you place a gun in our hands and an enemy force in front of us, our primal instincts will lead us to kill. This, however, is not the case. Most people will not fire on an enemy unless they have been properly trained to kill. They must be psychologically conditioned to overcome their profound repulsion toward taking the life of another man. A groundbreaking study by U.S. Army Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall during World War II brought this fact to light. Marshall and his team of researchers interviewed combatants who fought in Europe and the Pacific. Their goal was to understand what these soldiers actually did during their time on the front lines. What they discovered shocked them to their core. The overwhelming majority of men, up to 85% in some cases, never fired their weapons at enemy troops. Marshall's methodology has since been criticized, but few scholars deny his essential conclusion that even soldiers in the heat of battle are deeply repulsed by the act of killing. As Grossman explains, those who would not fire did not run or hide. In many cases, they were willing to risk great danger to rescue comrades, get ammunition, or run messages, but they simply would not fire their weapons at the enemy, even when faced with repeated waves of enemy charges. Intrigued by the results of Marshall's study, historians looked back at other wars and found compelling evidence of similarly low rates of firing. For example, battlefield excavations from the American Civil War discovered a high proportion of muskets that were loaded multiple times but never fired. This suggests that only a minority of soldiers ever actually discharged their weapon at another human being. So, what accounts for this profound reluctance to fire? Interviews with soldiers led Marshall to conclude that the average and healthy individual has such an inner and usually unrealized resistance towards killing a fellow man that he will not, of his own volition, take life. If it is possible to turn away from that responsibility, that a man would avoid killing another man, even in war, is not surprising. Killing another human being is one of the most traumatic experiences one can possibly endure. Many soldiers who have opened up about the experience display immense guilt and remorse for what war forced them to do. For example, after killing a Japanese soldier at close range during World War II, the U.S. Marine William Manchester wrote movingly of his reaction, "I can remember whispering foolishly, 'I'm sorry,' and then just throwing up. I threw up all over myself. It was a betrayal of what I'd been taught since a child." This powerful sentiment was echoed by a U.S. Special Forces officer who killed a boy during a Vietnam War battle. He recounted, "I froze. Cosset was a boy, I would say between the ages of 12 and 14, when he turned at me and looked, and pointed his automatic weapon at me. I just opened up, fired the whole 20 rounds right at the kid. I dropped my weapon and cried. While repulsed by the act of killing, most of us can be conditioned to overcome this repulsion. In the process, we can be turned into lethal killers. Following Marshall's discovery, the US Army made a concerted effort to increase the firing rate. They did this by implementing new training methods and other psychological conditioning techniques. These techniques were tragically successful. By the time of the Vietnam War, estimates suggest that the firing rate had reached upwards of 80% to 90%. These training methods include reflexive firing drills at realistic human-shaped targets. They also include training scenarios that meticulously simulate the overwhelming stress of combat. These techniques help lay down new neural pathways. These pathways condition men to fire without thinking too much about what they are doing. The historian Gwyn Dyer explains that an infantry company in World War II could wreak such havoc with only about 1/7 of the soldiers willing to use their weapons. This is a testimony to the lethal effects of modern firepower. But once armies realized what was actually going on, they at once set about to raise the average. Part of the job can be done by weapons training that actually lays down reflex pathways that bypass the moral sensor. The long, grassy fields with bullseyes give way to combat simulators with pop-up human silhouettes that stay in sight only briefly. If you fire instantly and accurately, they drop. If you hesitate, they disappear in a couple of seconds anyway. But conditioning the reflexes only does half the job. It is also necessary to address the psychological reluctance to kill directly. These days, soldiers are taught, very specifically, to kill. Dyer suggests that modern military training exerts an almost religious-like conversion on the recruit. Before enlisting, the recruit is typically a young man constrained by the moral prohibitions against violence. He is naturally repulsed by the act of killing. If the training is effective, however, he is transformed into a soldier who kills on command. This transformation varies from time to time and from country to country. In totally militarized societies like ancient Sparta or the samurai class of medieval Japanese, begins at puberty or even before. In large modern societies, the process is briefer and more concentrated. It is, essentially, a conversion process. One of the most important factors in this conversion is the fostering of a strong group solidarity among recruits. When a deep sense of camaraderie is formed, a man can be driven to commit atrocities he would never have imagined doing on his own. Soldiers often become so close to those in their military units that they will fire upon the enemy, rather than risk letting down their comrades. As Grossman writes, a tremendous volume of research indicates that the primary factor motivates a soldier to do the things that no sane man wants to do in combat is not it is a powerful sense of accountability to his comrades on the battlefield. A tight group bond also diminishes the feelings of guilt associated with killing. It does this by granting each individual soldier a sense of anonymity and moral To paraphrase Konrad Lorenz, man is not a killer, but the group is. A third effect of group solidarity is the intensification of emotion. Groups tend to magnify and mirror any strong emotions that arise in its individual members. If a military unit contains a few soldiers with strong feelings of hatred toward the enemy, these emotions can spread to other members and be magnified. Ben Shalit, of the National Defense Research Institute in Sweden, explained that all crowding has an intensifying effect. If aggression exists, it will become more so as a result of crowding. The effect of the crowd seems to be much like a mirror, reflecting each individual's behavior in those around him, and thus intensifying the existing pattern of behavior. In this way, the individual moral barrier is broken down and replaced by a collective, violent psyche. The war machine, propaganda, profit, and our responsibility in addition to promoting group solidarity. Another critical method of conditioning men to kill is through the age-old technique of dehumanizing the enemy. Soldiers are subjected to immense amounts of propaganda. This propaganda depicts the men and women they are sent to kill as less than human. Their very existence is portrayed as a threat to all that is good and true in the world. The basic aim of a nation at war is establishing an image of the enemy in order to distinguish as sharply as possible the act of killing from the act of murder, wrote the philosopher Glenn Gray. As Richard Gabriel puts it, men dehumanize the enemy as the only way to justify their own horrible acts. Otherwise, it would be impossible to remove the blood from the soldier's hands. Of all the means to minimize man's reluctance to kill, however, the most effective is to maximize the physical distance between the killer and his victim. It is far easier to kill a man from hundreds of meters away with a bullet than it is to kill in hand-to-hand combat. It is easier still to drop a bomb or fire a missile at distances so great that the victims never enter the killer's field of vision. The most horrifying form of killing occurs when one must look the victim in the eyes. As Grossman writes, this can explain why Nazi, communist, and gangland executions are traditionally conducted with a bullet in the back of the head. It is also why individuals being executed by hanging or firing squad are blindfolded or hooded. We know from research that the risk of death for a kidnapped victim is much greater if the victim is hooded. The eyes are the window of the soul, and if one does not have to look into the eyes when killing, it is much easier to deny the humanity of the victim. With advanced training, psychological conditioning, and weapons that increase physical distance, most men can be transformed into killers, and this does not bode well for preventing the outbreak of a Third World War. For, as WWII writes, if the inhibition against killing can be removed in most people by a little routine psychological conditioning, then we still have a lot to worry about. To make matters worse, many modern politicians do not place much value on the lives of the mass. They are also highly influenced by the powerful institutions, individuals, and corporations that benefit from the act of war. The former Marine Corps Major General and American whistleblower Smedley D. Butler wrote with damning clarity, "War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest easily. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. While billions of dollars are transferred from the tax-paying citizenry to the military-industrial complex, war also centralizes the power of the state. War provides a ready-made justification for increased government control. It allows politicians to strip citizens of their rights and force them to do things that would never be permitted in times of peace." In George Orwell's 1984, the totalitarian government used perpetual war to maintain tight control over the citizenry of Oceania. And while Orwell's book is fiction, the lessons it teaches are profoundly real. As Gerard Casey explains in his book Freedom's Progress, in war, all power and control moves inexorably towards the center. A war, any war, is essential to keep it there. If an external enemy can't be found, then an internal enemy must be discovered or manufactured. Or as Randolph Bourne famously put it, war is the health of the state. It automatically sets in motion throughout society those irresistible forces for uniformity, for passionate cooperation with the government, in coercing into obedience the minority groups and individuals which lack the larger herd sense, as so many in the ruling class see personal and political gains from the fighting of wars. We should not rely on these individuals to maintain peace. The ultimate responsibility lies with us, the people. More people need to see through the lies and propaganda that are used to justify war. More people need to be vocal in expressing their anti-war views. For speaking up and protesting against war is effective. In the build-up to war, governments often censor and even jail the dissidents who spread anti-war messages. This would be unnecessary if these messages didn't have the potential to shift public sentiment. The American political activist Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison under the Sedition Act for his speeches denouncing America's participation in World War I. He recognized the power of the anti-war voice. He also realized that it is always the ruling powers, never the people, who push a nation into the hell of war. As he wrote in a famous speech, "They have always taught and trained you to believe it, to be your patriotic duty to go to war, and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you the people have never had a voice in declaring war and estrange. As it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people." The great Russian author Leo Tolstoy echoes this exact sentiment. In all history, there is no war which was not hatched by the governments. The governments alone, independent of the interests of the people, to whom war is always pernicious. Even when successful, if we are not ruthless in expressing our hatred of war and ostracizing those who push us toward it, then, if another major war breaks out, responsibility lies in part with us. And given the advanced weapons that now exist, the next major war will create a hell on earth, not just for the soldiers that fight it, but for every single one of us. As WWII writes, the brief, one-sided campaigns of well-armed Western countries against dysfunctional Third World autocracies kill in the tens of thousands. The genocidal ethnic conflicts of fragile post-colonial states are local tragedies. But during the last 2 years of World War II, over 1 million people were being killed each month. If the great powers were to go to war with one another just once more, using all the weapons they now have, 1 million people could die each minute. Therefore, our silence in the face of warmongering could very well become complicity in a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The future depends on our collective voice.